filmmakers will perhaps live to enjoy that 34 years later, after something which flowered from the heart, would be met 3.5 decades later by a generation with such passion.
There's an honesty that you bring as a filmmaker and take a look at yourself, which is not something that most directors do. You can always make biopics and stuff. But to actually look at oneself and present that as an autobiography, that's a distinct signature. But the man who's going to have the conversation with you, because he's an expert, he's one of the country's best-known critics, please put your hands together to welcome Bharadwaj Rangan.
I would like to start this by talking about the women characters. Earlier we had the vamp or we had the heroine. It was like either a Bindu or a Helen, or we had the heroine. And the people like what Smita Patil played in the middle, who could be seen by Shabana Azmi as a vamp because, you know, you're taking her husband away and all that. But she's definitely not an evil person. She's not a bad person. You know, she's a person who has her own demons to struggle with. I just wanted to ask you about how you came about structuring your women like that.
The defining attribute, as you said, about my work, which flowered out of me or bled out of me, was the angst. And I think it's the perfume which you can't define. I think sorrow is the heritage of man. And any significant work, if it endures, it has to have the perfume of sorrow. The pickle jar is built on what Vasanthi just said, that something which is done with love, but the taste lingers. And I think maybe all great works bloom out of the womb of loneliness, fierce and excruciating loneliness. You take away loneliness and the edifice of human culture collapses. Religious movements, political movements. And I think my films which will be written, which will head my obituary, will be movies like Art Saransh, Zakum, Janam, which were something which I first lived, and then I tried to understand what I experienced and tried to put it into with my limited understanding of the craft. And so there's a kind of rough edges to it. There's a kind of rawness to it. And truthfully, doesn't care for eloquence. It itself is there. So yes, it's like the analogy I give of the oyster, and the grain of sand gets into the craw of the oyster. It causes the oyster great anguish, and the oyster, in order to escape that pain, turns it into a pearl. The intention is not to manufacture a pearl, but to escape the anguish. And I think Art came from the trauma of a young man who fell in love with a woman and believed in the fairy tale of one man, one woman, and they lived happily ever after. And then he fell in love with this fiercely lonely woman, and then how he was torn between these two, and then he saw her crumble into the abyss. Praveen Babi I'm talking about. And so the life burns were the raw material from which I created. In the 20s, my turbulent 20s, I was just a person who was nipped in the bud. I made some 4 unmentionable films. But I think after the disaster of my personal life, where my life turned into a wasteland, anything I touched turned into a wasteland, somehow this experience of an extramarital affair and the crack up of Praveen Babi became the raw material. But as you rightly said, I looked at the whole narrative from the point of view of the women who were involved, because that was the real challenge, because to what it was for them, because I realized that your extramarital affair affects everybody around you. It's not an isolated action of yours. And I think the women are perhaps very powerful in my film, because I came from a single parent home. My mother was a Shia Muslim woman who was living, quote unquote, in sin with my father, who was a filmmaker, was in love with her, but she was a closet Muslim masquerading as a person of the majority faith. And I saw her very closely, and to me, she was my shrine. She was the fountainhead of wisdom. But she was a very tough chick. She was very strong. To be able to live in the 40s and not be beat her chest that she was being, life had given her a raw deal, or she had got it, she wanted cards to be dealt again. She lived with dignity and she lived with tremendous courage. So for me, a woman alone, living life on her own terms, is something which I saw as a reality. So when I meet a 22-year-old Alia Bhatt, who's my child, who's a star now, when I leave at the crack of dawn to take a flight at 6, I see Alia coming back from a late night shoot, and when I hug her and I wish her goodbye, I'm reminded of my mother, that she used to wake up in the early hours of the morning, offer a namaz quietly, before she didn't want the children to know about her faith, and then get ready to deal with the realities of the house, because my father was going through a bad time. So I felt that women around me always were very powerful. They're very, my daughter Pooja, very strong women. So for me to respect women and to see that they're made of sterner stuff, was not something which was difficult. Whether it's a Pasha Basu in Jism, who says कि ये जिस्म प्यार करना नहीं जानता है सिर्फ हवस भूख जिस्म की भूख, who negates the whole narrative of love and says that just lust is a reality which is hardwired. Hunger and lust are the reality, truth of the human organism. Rest is the cultural crap that you have hardwired on it. And so I think that, but she necessarily has to be portrayed as a vamp, because you cannot take such a subversive discourse. Because anything that does not endorse, perpetuate, or defend a lie that you pretend to represent and actually do not follow privately will not find bums on the seat, or will not get you a Bharat Ratna or a Padma Shri. Okay. You know, it's much later after you're dead and gone, your irreverence will be worshipped. But when you're living, unless you endorse and maintain status quo, defend, become a part of the status quo regime, the chances of you surviving in this marketplace are slim to none. So I said there are two kinds of movies, one that comfort the jolted and the other that jolt the comforted. So the so-called realistic cinema jolt the comforted. And I always said, I'm interested in a home after the guests have gone, because that's when the house really reveals itself. So I discovered that you are what you hide. So journey to what you hide, and that's the beginning of all intimacy. That's where real relationships begin. And so I think these were the defining tragedies, quote unquote tragedies, which I marketed. Why not turn my wounds into some kind of money-making tool? So it was illegitimacy of mine, which I examined and I fearlessly articulated. Whether this was my extramarital affairs, they called me an exhibitionist. They said, "Why are you washing your dirty linen in public?" I said, "There's no charm in doing it in your backyard." So I just lived life on my own terms, and it's heartening to see that 34 years later, I still am here. Thank you.
Would you say that Earth was your biggest commercial success?
It was. It was surprisingly, it was an art house film. It was looked upon, though it was made by the mainstream money. And so Art had this kind of an adventurer filmmaker who made commercial films, and when he came to me to make a film called Sinbad the Sailor, believe it or not, and I said, "Why do you want to make Sinbad the Sailor? Why don't you make this film called Earth? I'll get you Shabana Azmi and these people for this kind of money." And he says, "Can you?" And I said, "Yes." And I went and requested them, and I got it. So I think it was that kind of made it possible for me to put that film together. And it's only when the mainstream investment is made onto what is called the alternate narrative. This was called in those days the middle of the road cinema. It became a box office hit on the very first day. It was released in Plaza, I remember. And then that's that iconic scene where Shabana says, "If I was in your place, would you accept me back?" And he says, "No." She says, "Goodbye." The auditorium clapped, and the claps came from the lower stall, because people in the balcony don't clap. The masses clapped, and the moment the masses clapped, I said the film has worked. That became I was twice born, as they say, with that film.
So you just mentioned that you told somebody who came into the money that, "Let's make this movie, I can get you Shabana." Now, how did Smita Patil come into the picture?
Oh, well, that's a fascinating tale. I said, I want to make a film with three women, I said. One is a housewife, the other is a star, and the other is a maid. He couldn't understand what the hell I was talking about. So I said, Shabana asked me, he said, oh, Shabana asked me because she was a national award winner. I said, there's a girl called Smita Patil. Yes, he says, I've seen her on the news and I believe she's now making ripples. And I said, and there's another girl called Rohini Hatangadi. He said, who is she? So I said, you'll find out who she is. So I said, fine. He says, you can get them? I said, yeah, I'll get them. So I got Shabana to say yes. Shabana was a dear friend. And then I went to Smita, and I remember I went to her late in the night at a place called Film City. And the producer had given me $10,000 to sign her up. He says, कि अगर कहानी सुना के हाँ बोल दे तो sign कर लेना उसको. भागने मत देना. A lot of people are going. So I said, okay. So I went there and I was waiting for her, and then she got to know I was there. And then she came. I still remember she came, walked out after she was shooting for a film called Tajuruba, I remember. And she came, and I'm leaning against the car. I said, I want to make a film, and I have a film which is sourced from my understanding of my own life. And I narrated her the story in about 15 minutes. And she said, I'll do it. I said, thank you. And then I took out the packet from my pocket and I gave it to her. She said, what is this? I said, money. She said, you're going to pay me for it also? So I said, yeah. So, I mean, when I say this to my friends in the industry, they say, where are those guys that used to talk like this? I think she was made up of different stuff. She just decided to, and once she was on board, well, that's another story.
So when you wrote when you wrote Earth, you had in mind that Shabana would play.
Shabana was, yes, she was clearly that the wife, and Smita was supposed to play the other woman.
The star.
And she had the body. She was like, she had all this. She was all wired up, and she reminded me a lot of Parveen when she went through what is called her breakdown. I mean, she had the attack of schizophrenia. And when I would talk to her, she would just inhale me, not through my words, but through my silences. It was, even the words that you speak stand on something which you can never express. Like I'm talking right now. There's a lot more behind from where these words are flowering. So she would listen to that, and she would listen with her entire being. But she used to fight with me because she herself was going through a very painful phase. She was involved with a man who was a married man. So she would say, it's terrible. She said, I have to live that life in the night and come in the morning and shoot the same kind of life on screen. And she said, I can't figure out whether it is this, that is reality, this is reality, the lines blurred. And that is why I think I was just empty, downloading what I had recently been subjected to. I've been through a firestorm. So I was just kind of getting it out of my system. I had inhaled and I had to exhale. And here she was going through that. So she added another layer completely. So she was very stark. There was nothing, there was no staging which was looked through the prism of whether it's artistically sound, whether this is right. There were no measurements and there were no external references but our own lives that we lived, and that became the source from where we drew.
So in a way, she was giving a performance almost in a similar way that you had made the movie.
Yes, she was doing it exactly the way, and adding something which was unimaginable. What she would do to a scene was something which she would make it so real. She would make it so real. And that came from her living reference point. It was not an abstraction for her. Being related to a man who's married and going through hell was not an abstraction. She didn't have to intellectually arrive at that point. It's like something, you got a living wound there and you draw from that, and you don't draw from some idea of somebody else's wound.
Right. Can you give an instance of, do you remember a scene which you had written and she kind of elevated a thousandfold on when she was performing? I'm sure that it's happened a lot, but is there any specific?
There's a shot in the film when she's been humiliated in the party by Shabana. We had a major problem in that scene because by the time we shot that scene, her stock had risen and she had become a star to, to really, pursue. And Shabana was not quite close to her at that moment. And so we had this scene, and the scene required that she walks into a party with her lover, and she runs into this drunken wife, and she humiliates her, and she has to run away from there. And it was supposed to be a scene. Without that, the film wouldn't go to the next scene. So I remember when my producer was very apprehensive whether she would shoot a scene like this. I said she wouldn't. But when she came and she read the scene, she said, is this necessary? I mean, does she have to do this? Does she have to come publicly and do this? She can take me aside, we can talk. So I looked at her, I said, Smita, didn't I tell you that this film requires that scene where the wife confronts the other woman, and because of the cultural strength that she has as a wife, the other woman, no matter how powerful she is or how much she has loved this man, cannot look into her eyes, and she runs away like a bitch with her tail between her legs. Didn't I use these words? She said, you did. So I said, is it fair to ask me to step back from what I said? She said, no, let's do it. And then she, with all her integrity, so one take, she did what she did. And to show fear, animal fear, when she's faced with somebody who has the authority of a wife, was not an easy thing, because the vanity of actors interferes to kind of crumble and to look small. She really became like when a bigger animal attacks other animal, the other animal becomes small or rises up, right? So here she was small, and the way she runs away. Now that was something which she doesn't have a dialogue in it. So with all the verbal dialogue power and all the energy that Shabana's character had, her silence with which she kind of withdrew and ran away was something unimaginable, and that's what makes that scene. And then later on, when she tries to overdose herself, and there's a shot where she comes down the staircase trying to hold the fear within her own body. That was exactly the way she somehow managed to transport my memory of Parveen into her body, that Parveen would be ravaged by the fears, unimaginable fears of being destroyed. But she would hold it within her body. It's like as if there was a river in spate within her body. And she would walk down with that, holding a storm within. So if you see that shot, she just walks with that energy, and then she has this conversation with the doctor. Then she tries to kill herself, but she's putting water on her face. That was the most amazing. The other scenes, of course, are very good, like the scene where she's sitting down when she's cracked up, and Shabana comes to see her when she says, "Tumne apne mangalsutra ko tod ke yahan kyun pheka hai?" That was something which I wrote at one go, and I explained to her how Parveen was to imagine that her house is bugged, and she would keep on tearing the carpets and tearing things down. So I said, I used that as a reference to explain to her. I said she must actually feel it under her feet. And whatever I would say, she would just inhale it and add her entire being to it and change it into something else. She was like a mirror. She just mirrored my fire and added a lot more to it.
We talked about Shabana Azmi a bit. Now, everyone is spurred on to some extent by competition, and so I wanted you to talk about...
Well, they had the most fascinating relationship. If Shabana was scared of one person, it was Smita Patil.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, how much of Shabana's success and do you think came from the fact that Smita Patil was in that
Shabana was honest and brave enough to say that when Smita went, even she was finished, because she did not have a worthy contender. And during the making of Earth, Shabana was very worried about what's happening when her scenes are not there with Smita. Smita was very, very worried about how she was being portrayed. In fact, towards the end of Earth, we got into a kind of a quarrel because it had reached her ears that there were certain editing decisions I had taken where I had pruned certain scenes which I had done because of Arth.
Which
Not,
mo-
I had not pruned certain scenes. I had taken the tail off of a scene or a shot here and there, because I felt that ultimately the narrative was the wife's narrative, and it couldn't possibly look at all these sides. And so I remember she had got a little upset and she stopped talking to me. And then once I'd gone to meet Mr. Vijay Tendulkar at the Parkway Hotel, and I was coming down, and Tendulkar ji told me, see, you better leave because your friend Smita Patil is coming and she doesn't like you anymore. So I said, okay, I will leave. So I was going down, and lo, I ran into her. And she looked at me, and she, like a child, she tried to avoid me and kind of, walk past me. And I said, look, Smita, we can't run away from this. Why are you angry with me? She said, you have done injustice to my role. You have cut it out. I said, listen, you can accuse me of being not so talented to do justice to your role, but you cannot accuse me of being partial. I'm not partial to Shabana. I may have failed. It could be an artistic or intellectual limitation. And when I said that, she started crying and she hugged me. She said, why do you say these things and then take my anger away? I said, because I want to be friends with you. Shabana and she really praised her with a very genuineness. And Shabana knew that there was somebody who could stand up to her, was Smita, because she had that raw, rough edge, which was perhaps not there. Because I think the cultural upbringing of Shabana had kind of taken that rough edge of her. She was polished. She had the misfortune of the tehzeeb, because the raw perfume of life was not there in Shabana like it was there in Smita. That gave her the edge.
When a lot of people pass away, we say what a loss, but then they have lived a long life, they've had a long career. But in Smita Patil's case, it really was, you could say that with genuine and mean it genuinely, because it was such a truncated career. Do you remember, the day, and what was the reaction?
I remember the day before, 2 days before 2 or 3 days before she passed away. She was a dear friend. She would come into my home when she was having bouts of fierce loneliness. She would suddenly descend in at odd hours in the nights. And I said, what happened? She said, no, I just felt fiercely alone. And she just wanted to be close to someone where she could be herself. Like, I never forget that day when she was looking into the night, and when I came home, my wife told me that, oh, Smita is here, something is bothering her. So I went there, she was standing with her back, and she was looking into the night, and I went to her. She was wearing grey, I remember distinctly, and she sensed me, and I said, what? And she said, I don't think I'm going to live long. I said, why you say that? So you're going through the anxiety attacks and all that. She used to have the problem with her stomach. She had this. But I remember meeting her after she got married and all that. She decided to have the baby. I went to see her at her home in Bandra. And when I walked into her house in the afternoon, the house did not have the air of a home, which has had a joyous experience of a new life coming there. I couldn't feel the stirring of life there. I could feel a lot of enormous weight there. Of course, I could smell a baby's presence. And there was a nanny walking up and down, and there was this smell of powder. And then she came out, but her mind was more inside with her baby. And she came out, and I could see that she was struggling with this role of motherhood. Motherhood was a role she was perhaps not prepared for. She was in a way bewildered by what she had got into. And she was conversing with me, but I could see that her heart was not in the conversation. So I decided to spare her that anguish of being with me when she didn't want to be with me because she had a baby inside. So I said, I'll see you then sometime. She said, come in an evening, that's when he sleeps. The pattern of the baby is something we have to adjust to. And then I left, and that was the last time I saw her. The next time I saw her when she was a corpse, and then I heard, of course, she had taken ill and we went to the hospital. That was the fade out of Smita Patil.
Where do you think Smita Patil's career might have gone had had she lived?
She was Born to Die Young. See, what the Smita that you know from her movies is not, is when you try and assess her, as Maitri said, through her movies, is you don't do justice to her. Her fumblings, her stumblings, her frailties, her inadequacies, her not being able to make sense out of this magic and the mystery of life, and to be able to stay with her bewilderment, to be able to not sum it up, sum things up, was what made her. She was all the time struggling to find answers, and she couldn't find any answers. Not that we have found the answers, but she was very, very vocal about saying that in spite of doing all that she has done, she's nowhere close to. She thought that motherhood and the role that all women are promised, us are brainwashed to believe that you're incomplete till you marry and you have a home. She thought that she will find enduring bliss and peace there. But that, if I go by that afternoon when I saw her, where she became a mother, she was far away from a happy ending. She did not give me the feeling of a woman who had come to a point in life for which she had thirsted so much. And she says, here I am. It wasn't there. There was a feeling of inadequacy, an inability to cope, and some unexplainable burden that she was carrying. She was not in a position to articulate all that, but I could see that in her.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.